Today, Alessio and I will be discussing the Brown v. Board of Education case.
To begin with a summary of the background of this case, it mainly was associated with a problem in Topeka, Kansas in 1954. The case began December 9th of 1952 to May of 1954, and it focused on racial segregation of children in public schools, and it was actually one of the cornerstones of the civil rights movement. To elaborate on this idea and thinking back to decades prior, there was another case named the Plessy v. Ferguson case that racially segregated public facilities and made them legal as long as the facilities were equal, and this was in 1896. In this, the Jim Crow laws and the separate but equal doctrine stood for decades leading up to this court case. Now, leading up to the case, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP, worked to challenge segregation laws in public schools and had filed lawsuits as well. There are many plaintiffs, which are people who brought court cases against another in law, all around the United States, like in South Carolina and Delaware and Virginia. Specifically, a plaintiff named Oliver Brown filed a case against the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1951, as his daughter Linda Brown was not able to enter an all-white elementary school. The legal framework on which segregation rested formally established in 1896 by the court Plessy v. Ferguson decision, as stated before, was being dismantled. Challenged repeatedly by the NAACP, the doctrine of separate but equal was beginning to crack. Beginning in 1938, the Supreme Court had, in a number of cases, struck down laws where segregated facilities proved to be demonstrably unequal. So for some circumstances of the case, Linda Brown was an 8-year-old African-American girl and had been denied permission to attend elementary school only 5 blocks from her home in Topeka, Kansas. School officials refused to register her at the nearby school, assigning her instead to a school for non-white students that was around 21 blocks away from her home. Separate elementary schools for whites and non-whites were maintained by the Board of Education in Topeka. Linda Brown's parents filed a lawsuit to force the schools to admit her to the nearby but segregated school for white students. So for some constitutional issues of this, the central question addressed to the court involved the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which asked, does segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race, even though the physical facilities and other tangible factors may be equal, deprive the children of equal educational opportunities? In short, the court was asked to determine whether segregation of schools was at all constitutional according to the 14th Amendment. Now for the summary of Argument 1 for Linda Brown, led by Thurgood Marshall, an NAACP litigator who would be appointed to the court in 1967. Brown's attorneys argued that the operation of separate schools based on race was harmful to African American children. The extensive testimony was provided to support the contention that legal segregated resulted in both fundamentally unequal education and low self-esteem among minority students. The Brown family lawyers argued that segregation by law implied that African Americans were inherently inferior to whites. For these reasons, they asked the court to strike down segregation under the law.
Moving on to Argument 2 for the Board of Education, which was led by the attorneys George Hayes and James M. They were the attorneys for Topeka, which argued that the separate schools for non-whites in Topeka were equal in every way, despite, of course, the exclusion of distinct races other than Caucasian. And that being said, they were in complete conformity and guidelines with the Plessy standard. The buildings, the courses of studies offered, and the quality of teachers were completely comparable in both schools. Some minority schools have even said to have been better with better conditions and standards for the students than those offered at the schools for whites. They utilized the Plessy decision from the case in 1896 to argue that they had created equal facilities or schools, even though the children were in fact separated and therefore segregated by the color of their skin, ethnicity, and background. Continuing, they proceeded to argue the point that this type of discrimination did not harm students nor affect them personally, totally disregarding the feelings and concerns presented by the children's parents and family.
So for the analysis of Brown's argument, what I thought was significant was the people of color argued that they felt inferior to the whites. It was Chief Justice Warren writing for a unanimous court who penned the famous line that, quote unquote, in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. The court explicitly overturned Plessy, finding that segregation in schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The school board had argued that at the time it was enacted, the states that ratified the 14th Amendment did not intend for it to prohibit school segregation. This is what's known as the originalist reading of the Constitution. The Warren Court, despite asking at length about the history and circumstances of the 14th Amendment, ultimately did not use an originalist reading of the Constitution in his decision. Instead, Justice Warren calls an examination of the history of the 14th Amendment at best inconclusive regarding the amendment's intended effect on public schools. He said, we must consider public education in the light of its full development and its present place in American life throughout the nation. And segregated schools, the Supreme Court justices agreed, affected the hearts and minds of Black children in a way unlikely ever to be undone. Because segregated schools were inherently unequal, there could be no such thing as separate but equal, and Plessy was finally overturned.
Moving on, the analysis of the second argument, the minority schools were said to have been offering better education. However, this case is fighting for equality, not privilege, and regardless of which side has more of the privilege, this was going against what had been said. And they had no valid excuse for separating races within schools. This is from a different perspective. And they were more so proving why this action is acceptable rather than why it's necessary within the school systems. This case also inspired the activation of the civil rights movement and sparked reform ideals, as many were mad at they were on the side of the brown rather than the education. Moving on to the impact of the case nationally, it signaled the end of legalized racial segregation in the schools within the United States. It also overruled the separate but equal principle set in the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case, as Alessio did mention. It also allowed the Supreme Court to practice deeming actions unconstitutional versus constitutional. It also served as a catalyst for the initiation of the civil rights movement in the later years. It also led to the advances in desegregating households and housing situations, as well as public accommodations in areas. Not only that, but it changed American society and redefined the nation's ideals during this period of time. These are our sources. Thank you.